Okay, there we go. All right. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Truma, and what's going to happen is for the good portion of the rest of the book of Exodus, say for Shmot, the major concern is going to be that of the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle. This week asks about giving donations, the first building fund campaign, and then that is followed by a description of a portable sanctuary. What it was is the Mishkan, the tabernacle, had walls made of wood that was then covered with gold. And it was covered then on the top with several layers of material, some leather perhaps, certainly various wool and mixtures were put on top. And then there is a description of what goes inside of it. Eventually the Ark, the Aron, that will have eventually the 10 Commandments in it. A showbread table, there's or SHEW is how it's translated into English, where loaves of bread were placed from one Shabbat to the next on it. A candelabra, the menorah, a incense altar to burn incense on it. And this was, as it were, sort of the house of God. Eventually, we're told that when the Kadosh Baruch Hu, when the Holy One, praise be, speaks to Moshe, he speaks to him from above the ark, the portable ark, which had two kruvim, cherubim on top. And everybody, of course, good old Lost Ark movie are familiar with that. And then there is a large altar outside of this tent where the animal sacrifices would be brought. And then that whole area is then enclosed by a curtain to create a privacy area for the tabernacle. So we're going to talk about it this week and next couple weeks. I don't recall having mentioned last week that was the beginning of this 4 special Torah portions. If I didn't, I'm repeating it again. We have, at this time of year, as we're getting closer to the holiday of Pesach, of Passover, we have 4 special Torah readings. On the Shabbat that precedes Rosh Chodesh Adar, that was last week, we had what's called Parshat Shekalim. Parshat Shekalim, which is actually something we're going to read shortly, the very beginning of it, is a way of enumerating the men of Israel by each one giving a half shekel, and then for all the adult males, and then that was a way of knowing the population, at least for need of raising an army. Each person gave half a shekel to show their part, not the totality, but part. No one is by himself. You only become whole when you're together with others. And this donation was used to purchase the communal sacrifices that were brought in the temple later on, in the tabernacle in the wilderness. And the reason why this portion is read every year as a special Torah reading is because we're going closer to the holiday of Passover, and the shekalim were collected at this time in order to have the monies for the upcoming year's special sacrifices or additional sacrifices that might be offered. So now, then so we always take out a second Torah for the special reading, even though the reading that we have is going to be in Exodus. I see I'm freezing on the screen. I hope everybody can still hear me. But I tried the fix that worked on the good grief. it worked on the laptop, but it doesn't seem to be working on the my regular computer here at home. All right. So we take out 2 Torahs, and the second one is this maftir portion, and then there's a portion read for the Haftarah from the one of the prophetic books that parallels the account of the taking of the shekels. Now, so that's always the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh Adar. Then the Shabbat preceding Purim, because Purim is, as we'll see, is on the 14th of the month. We can have, it is possible to have 2 Shabbatot after Rosh Chodesh, so that sometimes it could be omitted. One of those readings would not be one of those weeks. So that the Shabbat just immediately before Purim is Parshat Zachor. Remember what Amalek did to you when you left Egypt. And as we'll see when we talk about Megillat Esther a little bit later, this was a reminder to destroy the enemies of Israel. And as I've mentioned before, since the rabbis understood they no longer existed, but nonetheless, a reminder that there are enemies of our people in the world. And that's connected with Purim, as I'll explain later. Again, we may have an intervening Shabbat because of the timetable of the month of Adar and how it falls on Shabbat Rosh Chodesh. So the Shabbat before the Shabbat before Rosh Chodesh Nisan is called Shabbat Parah, and that's reading about the Parah Aduma, the red heifer, that was sacrificed, and the ashes were used as part of the ritual purification from contact with dead bodies. And so, excuse me, this is again because in the days of the temple, people would have to get purified if they're going to be bringing the Passover sacrifice on Pesach. And then finally, the Shabbat that precedes Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we read from the book of Exodus, chapter 12, the account of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and that sets up the calendar, of course, leading into Passover. Right? So that's the upcoming Torah readings for each special Shabbat, the 4 special Shabbats that precede Pesach. All right, so I want to get right tonight straight into the holiday of Purim. We will talk about Megillat Esther in some detail in a little bit. We just lost somebody. And we will go over Megillat Esther as well. Okay, so first of all, Megillat Esther, the Book of Esther, is an account of an attack on the Jewish people, attempt to destroy the Jewish people. According to the Megillat Esther, it's all a plot of a man by the name of Haman or Haman, and a king, Ahasuerus, who was the king of the Babylonians at that time, who, depending upon interpretation, is either a bit of a fool, or others consider him to actually be as guilty as Haman, as we will read later. Anyway, this is supposed to take place in Shushan, the capital of Babylonia at that time. It's really the Persian Empire already, excuse me, I said Babylonian, Persian Empire. And it is not very easily defended historically, the whole issue, the whole story. But we're going right now, just treat it as a historical fact, at least giving us the parameters of how we celebrate. Again, I'll talk a little bit more later. So first of all, one of the first things that's unique about the holiday of Purim is that there are actually 2 days that it can be celebrated. Most places like Toronto or Tel Aviv or New York City, for example, celebrate Purim on the 14th day of the month of Adar. Adar is the last month of the year, according to the biblical counting of the months of the year. The exception to that is a walled city. It has to be a walled city. It was walled in ancient times. And that is explained by some that because Jerusalem at the time of the Purim story was not a walled city, because the walls had been torn down by the Babylonians. And therefore, in order to keep have Purim celebrated on the same day as it's going to be celebrated in Shushan, the capital city of the empire, and they said as long as it was a walled city dating back to the time of Joshua. So in Israel, Jerusalem, Tiberias, and I think there are a couple other places I forget at the moment, would read it on the 15th. Now, our custom today is we do not read Megillat Esther on Shabbat. So if the 14th of Adar falls out on Shabbat, then everybody reads the Megillat Esther on the 15th of Adar. If Adar falls out Erev Shabbat, then the walled cities would read it on the 14th of Adar and not on the 15th. But in theory, you could celebrate Purim in Tel Aviv, and the next night, go to Jerusalem and celebrate Purim a second time. All right. So Purim clearly has a very clear festive aspect to it. There's no serious quality to the month, to the observance. In many ways, it is parallels customs of many other cultures of towards the end of the winter, when the springtime is coming, to have a celebratory kind of occasion. And in some ways that it's got very different origins to it, but it's like Mardi Gras in a sense. Indeed, became a practice of dressing up in costumes on Purim, which of course is also associated to a certain extent with Mardi Gras. So we find that this kind of treatment of the holiday is spelled out in the Talmud. The Talmud says you're supposed to drink wine on Purim until you don't know the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman, which takes a lot to do. The rabbis over the course of the centuries have had some misgivings about this tradition. And so some, especially today, say that you drink a little bit more than you normally, and then you take a nap. And after you finish your nap, after the Shabbat, after the meal in the afternoon, it's when you're asleep, you can't tell the difference between Baruch, Mordechai, Arur, Haman. Others prefer the more straightforward interpretation to imbibe a little bit heavily with alcoholic beverages on the holiday. So how do we observe Purim? First of all, we have the reading of Megillat Esther. The evening of Purim, Purim evening, and then Purim day at the morning service, we read it again. It's read twice. You have to read it at night, and you read it again in the morning. And this tells the basic story, as we'll go over it a little bit later. Now, what's also kind of unique about it, well, there's several things. Just like the Torah portion, the Torah is read from a scroll. Megillat Esther has to be read from a scroll, a parchment. And it is chanted with the special trump of Megillat Esther. And what happens is there are certain passages that are said aloud. Sometimes the congregation is supposed to say the passages with the louder than normal. Say the passages with a person reading Megillat Esther. And also the part that everybody loves is that whenever we come to the mention of Haman, we're supposed to blot out the memory of Haman, which of course is kind of interesting. if we didn't read Megillat Esther every year, nobody would know who Haman was. But we read Megillat Esther every year, reminding everybody who Haman was. And in order to blot out his memory, we make noise. So there's the Grogger. Here's a nice big Grogger, old fashioned. So you can. All right, so there you. That's a Grogger for you, demonstration. And so whenever Haman's name is mentioned during the course of the evening, we will make noise to blot out the mention of his name. So that takes place both in the evening and in the morning. And I want to try, we're not going to really do much in the way of Hebrew tonight, but I wanted to, is it? Oh, there we go. Okay. So we have, we'll go down to the blessings. Before we read Megillat Esther, we will have 3 blessings, both in the evening and in the morning. I think the print is big enough for everybody to be able to read, unless they got looking at it on a phone, in which case I don't know. Let's see. Let's try this. It's maybe a little too much. On that side of the screen. Okay. So if you don't if the letters you don't recognize, okay, but I'm going to read with you the blessings. So let us try and read it together. All right, so everybody keep their eye on it. The first word is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kidshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Mikra Megillah. So the only thing that is new to you is Mikra Megillah. Everything else you're used to having those words on the bracha. Mikra Megillah means reading Megillat Esther. The second bracha is we also say it on Hanukkah. We say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam She'asa Nisim La'avotenu Bayamim Hahem Bazman Hazeh. And then the last one is the Shehecheyanu. For some reason it's a little weird there. Okay. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Shehecheyanu V'kimanu V'higianu Lazman Hazeh. We thank God for enabling us to reach this occasion. So it's chanted in a special way. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Asher Kidshanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu Mikra Megillah. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Shasa Nisim La'avotenu B'yamim Hahem Bazman Hazeh. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Shehecheyanu V'kimanu V'yanu Bazman Hazeh. And then we begin Megillat Esther. Vayi V'mei Achashverosh U'Achashverosh, etc., etc. Okay. Then there's also a blessing that we have after we've finished reading Megillat Esther. Let's see if we can move it over a little bit. Okay, it's Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam Harav Et Rivenu V'Hadan Et Dinenu V'Hanokem Et Nikmatenu V'Ham Shalem Gemul L'chol Oivei Nafshenu V'Nifra Lanu Mitzarenu Baruch Atah Adonai Hanifra Le'amo Yisrael Mikol Tzarehem Ha'el HaMoshiach. So those are the blessings that we recite before and after we read Megillat Esther. Okay. All right. So now, so the evening of Purim, we don't have anything special, although usually people do try to have somewhat of a festive meal, or at least a little more festive than normal, perhaps. But we have the evening service, the normal evening service. We have some additions that we add into the tefillah, into the prayer service, just during when we recite the Modim Anafnilach portion. You'll see it's in the Siddurim, Al Hanisim, Al Niflot, Mashiot, the miracles and wonders of God and salvations God did perform for us at this time. And then we read Megillat Esther. In the morning, we have the morning service. We all have a Torah reading on Purim, and that Torah reading something. That Torah reading again talks about the Amalekites, as I will, who are associated with Haman, and then Megillah Esther is read again. Now, there are so the first of the mitzvot that are associated with the holiday of Purim is the reading of Megillat Esther evening and morning. There are two other mitzvot that are the rabbis prescribed for performance on the day of Purim, not the night, but the day of Purim. It's based upon passages found in Megillat Esther. One is called in Hebrew Mishloach Manot Ish L'Rayehu, sending gifts of food to friends. That's explicitly mentioned in the Megillat Esther, and the rabbis understood it. It says portions of food, gifts of food to Re'ehu, a person to his neighbor, his friend. So at least two edible items are sent to one person. That's the basic mitzvah. Everyone is supposed to at least give some kind of a gift basket, a food basket to friends on Purim. So that basically is a gift of two edibles to one friend. Some people give out a lot more than just that. In normal years we do. We're going to be gone for Purim, and I'll take note of that later. We'll send out lots of things. So your house may be full of gift baskets on Purim. The third of the four mitzvot, in Hebrew, matanot le'evyonim, gifts to the poor. We are told that whenever we have a celebration, we should always make sure that the people who are poor are able to celebrate as well. And so this may have been part of the idea behind it, so that on Purim Day, you're supposed to give charity to at least two needy people. Some have the tradition of giving half coins of whatever your part of the world you're in. Half a dollar, for example, here in Canada. I'm sorry, just trying to fix that camera. To the needy. You know, in some communities, and you'll find it around many Orthodox synagogues, is that people come who need help, and they will be around the synagogue with their hands out, hoping that you will give them some tzedakah. Some synagogues have fundraising to raise money this way to give to the needy. So it's a way of having them join in all of the celebrations. The last of the aspects of the four mitzvot of Purim is called the Purim Sudah, or Su'udat Purim, the Purim meal. Unlike most celebrations, this meal is not the evening of or the lunchtime of, but in the afternoon, towards the end of the day. A festive meal was to be had, and that's where the idea, where the drinking came in. There's a very famous story in the Talmud that one rabbi invited another rabbi to come to his home for Purim, and they both got so drunk that one rabbi killed the other rabbi. And but since he was such a holy rabbi, he was able to restore him to life. And the next year, he invited him to come back to his house, and the other rabbi says, "No, we're not going to rely on a miracle 2 years in a row." So that's already we have this idea of watching out how much you really drink, and if you are going to drink a lot, should be very careful. Make sure that you're going, if you have to get from one place to another, you can do it without you having to drive. Designated driver, designated. All right. Finally, okay, so those are the mitzvot that are associated with Purim. Now, along with that, there's one other thing that you may be familiar with, and that's called hamantashen. It's a candy, not a candy, a cake, pastry, a triangular shaped pastry, and has different fillings that are in it. Originally, really, what it is it comes from the Yiddish word, Yiddish. There was a kind of cookie that in Northern Europe. It was filled with mun. Mun is, not pomegranate, I'm saying pomegranate. Oh, how can I make a mistake like that? Look, sometimes as you get a little older, you start forgetting things. Poppy seed, that's a poppy seed. Poppy seed in Yiddish was mun. And tashin is a pocket. So it really was meant a pocket of poppy seeds. And in Hebrew, it's called oznei Haman, Haman's ears. And you hear all kinds of stories in Maisalach about it because it's shaped like a triangle. So it was supposed to be Haman's hat. Well, because at one period in history, tri-cornered hats was popular, but certainly that was not worn by Haman. But that became associated with it, and it became part of Jewish tradition because there was a cookie that was made at that time. So hamantash, and so mun tashin was then kind of, it elided into Haman tashin, Haman's tashin, Haman's pockets. So that's how it became associated with the holiday of Purim. So that is the basic background for that. And I want to grab them, Gilles, to be right back. First, a little bit of background. Megillat Esther is one of the 5 Megillot found in the last section, Ketuvim, of the Bible. It is said to have been written down by Mordechai, one of the heroes of the story, and sent out to all of the Jewish people, testifying to the events that are recorded in it. Now, while most scholars looking at it note that there's a lot of Persian loanwords in it, there is familiarity with a lot of Persian customs, but at the same time, it has very clear problems with it. As we'll see, Esther is supposed to become the queen without anybody knowing her family. That would have been impossible in ancient Persia. The whole scheme of things seems to be somewhat problematic. And it is, according to Bible's critics, it's a much later work, and it's based upon various forms of literature that was current at that time. But just to show you an example of how this really is based on at least knowledge of the Persian world, this notes in this one text that I have says the Greeks were also impressed by Persian banquets, which in their eyes one of the outstanding traits of Persian social life that stood in marked contrast to Greek life. Greek descriptions of these banquets are quite similar to the Book of Esther's, with an emphasis on the quantity and luxury of the dinnerware and the food and drink consumed. They mention glass vessels in addition to gold and silver ones, and a variety of meats. And so we have this clear parallel, and we see from other sources that that was not an unknown thing in that world. So whether or not we take it literally, I personally don't take it literally. I take it as a story with basically to tell us that God's activity is often hidden, because one of the important things to note, God's name is never once mentioned in the book of Esther, Megillat Esther. Even when any other moment in time you expect the mention of God, we do not have God mentioned. The rabbis discuss why. Some suggest because they were afraid that since this was a letter that Mordechai sent out, it might get destroyed, and God's name would be destroyed. But I think the hidden quality of God's actions is explanation enough for the absence of his name. It opens by saying, Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. It happened in the days of Achashverosh, who was Achashverosh, who reigned over 120 provinces. Many moderns assume that this is the Persian Achashverosh, who's Xerxes. Another version of the Septuagint, for example, in the Peshitta, another translation of the Bible into Aramaic, read the name is Artaxerxes. Now, the historical Xerxes the first reigned from 486 to 465 BCE, and Artaxerxes from his son, or his father, came after him, 465 to 424. So this is dating is within the realm of it, but it's hard to say that these names really are the figures, or that the historical figures really are active in this story. In any case, so let's hear. So it opens up by telling us about Achashverosh and his kingdom, and he has this big party in the fortress of Shushan, the 3rd year of his reign, and gives this wonderful banquet, and everybody's invited to it. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. And then after that period of time, he then has another banquet for 7 days for the people who live in Shushan, high and low light. Now, Shushan is either the capital city, Shushan, or more likely by here, when it says Shushan Abirah, means the fortress of Shushan. All right. And then it describes there were hangings of cotton and blue wool caught up by cords of fine linen and purple wool to silver rods and alabaster columns, couches of gold and silver on a pavement of marble, alabaster, mother of pearl mosaics. The drinking ware was golden beakers of varied design, and there was royal wine in abundance as befits a king. Now, this is, again, associated with the idea of drinking, and that also associates what's going to happen in a moment. So it makes clear the rule for the drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. All right, so they were going to give you wanted wine, you got wine, you wanted scotch, I guess you got scotch, if you wanted bourbon, you got whatever you wanted. All right. And now next thing is we're told that Gam Vashti Hamalka, Vashti the queen, also had a feast, a banquet for women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. You know, it's known that this indeed was normative, that the men and women did not partake together in these banquets when drinking. So we certainly see this here, but that also then plays into the needs of the story. Okay, so we have the big banquet of the men, banquet for the ladies. On the seventh day, remember this is the second go around of 7 days, when the king was merry with wine, right? He drank a lot. He ordered, now the names are always problematic, especially in English. It's easier to read them in the Hebrew for me, but in Human, Bista, Harvana, Bigta, Gata, Zeiter, Karkas, the 7 eunuchs and attendants on King Ahasuerus. Eunuchs is probably just nomenclature for at this point in history for people who served the king in official capacity, not necessarily really eunuchs. But in any case, so he tells these people to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. Straightforward reading of this. We have 1, Ahasuerus is drunk. 2, he wants to show off his wife because she's regarded as being beautiful. Now, Vashti is going to be eliminated from our story very shortly. And as is the case with many books of the Bible, the rabbis' imagination in the Midrash flows, both the rabbis and others told the story, adds on various elements that are not recorded in Megillat Esther. So if Vashti indeed is executed, although it's not at all clear that happens, and it's clear that she has to be taken out in order to get Esther in as queen, well, she had to have done something wrong, something bad, otherwise it would not be right for her to be killed so that Esther could become the queen. So the rabbis explain that she was really a very wicked woman, that she had the daughters of Israel serve her, and she made them serve her naked. Well, they were naked. She even said to have killed them, some of them, and bathed in their blood. All right. So this sets the background for the next verse. Okay, because the king says to bring Vashti, and it says, literally says, before the king in the royal diadem, in the royal crown, to display her beauty. The rabbis note it says in the crown. It doesn't say anything about anything else. So he wants to show her off naked, just wearing the crown. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. So Vashti won't do it. Now, once again, it doesn't, if indeed we look at just straightforward, the clear reading of it, The king is drunk. He wants to show her off, and she's not going to be shown off in front of a bunch of drunkards. That would be the straightforward reading of it. But again, the rabbis playing on this say, no, Vashti had no problems with showing up naked. So why wouldn't she show up naked? Because as a punishment to her, God made her grow a tail at that time. And she was embarrassed that she might show up with a tail. And that's why she refused. So she refused the request. The king is very angry, and he consults the sages what should be done. And his close advisors, he says, what he asked them shall be done according to law to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs. Thereupon the Mukhan declared in the presence of the king and the ministers, Queen Vashti has committed an offense not only against your majesty, but against all the officials and against all the peoples in all the provinces of Ahasuerus. Obviously she didn't. But this again is in the nature of the storytelling. The story is got many elements of this that are kind of absurd, the theater of the absurd, or a kind of mocking kind of story. She is accused of committing offense against everyone, the kingdom, just because the king, when he's drunk and asks her to come appear before him, she refused that command. And we'll see the punishment in a minute, or the rules in a moment, that show how absurd and the parody that is being used here. I'm trying to see all right. So what do they say? So it goes on to say, for the queen's behavior will make all wives despise their husbands, as they reflect the king Ahasuerus himself ordered Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. What's the problem? All you women are going to get uppity. All the wives are going to say, I'm not going to do what you tell me, dear husband. Queen Vashti can do it, I can do it. So this very day, he goes on to say, the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will cite it to all your majesty's officials, and there will be no end of scorn and provocation. All right, so this is the danger. All the women are going to think they don't have to listen to their husbands. If it please your majesty, let a royal edict be issued by you, and let it be written into the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be abrogated, that Vashti shall never enter the presence of King Ahasuerus. And let your majesty bestow her royal state upon another who is more worthy than she. Then will the judgment executed by your majesty resound throughout your realm, vast though it is, and all wives will treat their husbands with respect, high and low alike. So it just says she's not going to be allowed to come into the presence of the king anymore, and her title will be given to someone else. Like I say, the rabbi's midrash suggests that she lost her life. Okay. And this will be an abject lesson to all the women. So the proposal was approved by the king and the ministers, and the king did as Mukhan proposed. Dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king, to every province in its own script, and to every nation in its own language, that every man should wield authority in his home and speak the language of his people. So a ruling goes out, a law, everybody has to obey this, that wives must listen to their husbands, and something about the language was to be based upon whatever the husband spoke. The women had to use that same language. There are various other attempts to explain that last little part. So, like I said, as one again, my critical commentary says, a long tradition of interpretation sees this phrase in the following one as the wording of the edict that was sent throughout the empire. But as many scholars have seen, such an edict is unenforceable, if not downright silly, even in a farce. As Fox observes, this is not exactly what Memuchan called for, which was a declaration of Vashti's ouster. Right. So, be that as it may, we have this strange command going out, and now that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, we are now going to be introduced to our heroine, really the two heroes of our story, Esther and her uncle, her brother, uncle, we'll see in a second, Mordechai. Okay. So, the first version of The Bachelor, it was about to be brought to the world. Sometime afterward, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he thought of Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The king's servants who attended him said, "That beautiful young virgins be sought out for your majesty. Let your majesty appoint officers in every province of your realm to assemble all the beautiful young virgins at the fortress of Shushan in the harem, under the supervision of Hegai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women. And let them be provided with their cosmetics. And let the maiden who pleases your majesty be queen instead of Vashti." The proposal pleased the king, and he acted upon it. Okay, so he's going to, like I said, this is The Bachelor. And gets all these women to come. They're going to be collected. All right, so then we're told, in the fortress Shushan lived a Jew by the name of Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjaminite who had been exiled from Jerusalem in the group that was carried into exile along with King Jeconiah of Judah, which had been driven into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. At first, let's look at this opening line. All right, his name is Mordechai. Mordechai is the son of Yair, and then his grandfather Shimi, and then it would seem that his great-grandfather is Kish, and then he's described as being a Benjaminite who apparently had been living in Jerusalem and was exiled early on. So now the question that arises, exactly who is the one who was exiled? Was Mordechai the one exiled at that time? Furthermore, we have a strange fact that he's said to be a son, descended from Kish. Why is that important? Well, we'll see. Kish was the father of King Saul. So that makes King Saul and Mordechai related to each other as part of the same extended family. And that will figure in later on, as we shall see. All right. Right. So now, he was foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maiden was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordechai adopted her as his own daughter. So now, a couple of things to take note of. Hadassah means myrtle, and it seems apparently her Hebrew name, and it has a Babylonian name derived from the name of the goddess Ishtar, or the Persian Stara, meaning a star. And as is in the modern world, Jews often have both secular names that come from the secular language of where they live, and Hebrew names, traditional Hebrew names. It's also interesting to know, while we don't have a different name for Mordechai, Mordechai seems to come from the word, the name for Marduk. Marduk and Ishtar were two Babylonian gods, Mordechai being the god of war, Ishtar, as is often the case, his wife, and the goddess of love. And the rabbis understood that Mordechai and Esther actually had gotten married. How that works with everything is very problematic. I'm not going to spend any time on that. So anyway, so she's a beautiful woman, although the rabbis and rabbinic tradition tries to remove that description from her in various ways for various reasons. But she's swept up in this collection of girls, virgins, to be brought before the king. So if she was married to Mordechai, how could she have been a virgin? That's all problematic. All right. And Esther did not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordechai had told her not to reveal it. Right? So we have this idea of hidden identity, hidden things. Esther, well, it probably comes from Ishtar, also sounds like Hester, hidden. Hester Panim, when God hides his face. All of these figure in the attempts to understand what's operating in this book. But in any case, Mordechai tells her not to inform anybody of her actual background. Okay? So, and every single day, Mordechai would walk about in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was faring and what was happening to her. So he was keeping his eyes out on her. So now, when each girl's turn came to go to King Ahasuerus at the end of 12 months treatment prescribed for women, for that was the period spent on beautifying them, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and women's cosmetics. Okay, so they go to the spa for a whole year. It was after that that the girl would go to the king. Whatever she asked for would be given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. She would go in the evening and leave in the morning for a second harem in charge of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, guardian of the concubines. She would not go again to the king unless the king wanted her, when she would be summoned by name. All right, so it's a one-night stand. And the woman would not come again unless Ahasuerus summoned her specifically by name. So when the turn for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordechai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go to the king, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won his grace and favor more than all the virgins. So he set a royal diadem on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. King gave a great banquet for all his officials and courtiers, the banquets of Esther. He proclaimed a remission of taxes for the provinces and distributed gifts as befits a king. Okay, so he takes her as a wife. She becomes his chief wife. And the indication are that he obviously has other wives, secondary ones, as we'll see in a moment more. And it makes a big whoop-de-doo. The next verse, though, then says, when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordechai sat in the palace gate. So what's the second time? Why does he have to do it? He's already got Esther. So one explanation the rabbis give is because he was trying to get her jealous because she wouldn't tell her background. And or more likely, he just enjoyed the fact that he was able to have all these virgins. And so he kept it up. But anyway, that's meant to tell us that Mordechai sat in the palace gate. All right, so Mordechai seems he may have been official or low-level official in the Persian Empire. But Esther still did not reveal her kindred or her people as Mordechai had instructed her. For Esther, obeying Mordechai's bidding as she had done when she was under his tutelage. At that time, when Mordechai was sitting in the palace gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. Mordechai learned of it, told it to Queen Esther, and Esther reported it to the king in Mordechai's name. The matter was investigated and found to be so, and the two were impaled on stakes. This was recorded in the book of Annals at the instance of the king. Okay, so Mordechai finds out about the plot. He gets a message to Esther. Esther gets to the king. She says in the name of whom the message came. And so this is recorded, but nothing happens. Again, part and parcel of how the whole story is meant to set up. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. Esther's in the palace. Mordechai has saved the king's life. nothing unbecoming has happened except for poor Vashti. And so far, fun story, but nothing big. Achar hadvarim ha'eleh. So after these things, the king Achashverosh promoted Haman, son of Hamdata the Agagite, advanced him and seated him higher than any of his fellow officials. Okay, so there's this man by the name of Haman. His father's Hamdata, and he's called Agagite. This is significant, whether it's meant to be taken literally or not, because it we should set up. Remember, I said before that Mordechai is in some way seems to be related to King Saul. Agag was the king of the Amalekites. Saul was told by Shmuel to go and attack them, and Saul carries out the attack, but he doesn't destroy everything, and he doesn't kill the king Agag. Samuel comes and finds that there's cattle and stuff there they'd saved, and King Agag is alive, and tells Saul that he's going to lose the kingdom because of this. Samuel kills Agag, but Agag apparently had time, at least according to the Midrash, to go home, see his wife, have a child from that, and that eventually gave rise to Haman. So if that is to be taken as indicative of what's behind the scenes, Haman and Mordechai, in a sense, have a family feud, another TV show. Right? They are enemies of each other, which helps explain something in a moment. Okay, so Haman is set to be the king's chief vizier or whatever. And he goes on to say, all the king's courtiers in the palace gate knelt and bowed low to Haman, for such was the king's order concerning him. All right, so the king says everybody has to bow to Haman. But Mordechai would not kneel or bow low. Now, why? The problem here, first of all, the Midrash and others say that it has nothing to do with pride or insolence, but that Haman was set up as like a god, and Mordechai did not want to worship him by kneeling to him, or he wore an idol, and it would look like he was worshiping the idol. And so all of these different ideas make it objectionable to bowing to him only because of that. But certainly in distinction to the reality, Jews bow down to kings, and we'll see even later on, Esther bows to the king herself. There would be no Jews around if they didn't bow to the king. So there has to be something else involved here, which is absent from the text, hidden away again as much as hidden in this story. Okay, so then the king's courtiers who were in the palace gate said to Mordechai, why do you disobey the king's order? When they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordechai's resolve would prevail, for he explained to them that he was a Jew. Somehow he this connection that Mordechai is a Jew, that was connected to the fact he would not bow to Haman. All right. When Haman saw that Mordechai would not kneel or bow low to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordechai alone, having been told who Mordechai's people were. Haman plotted to do away with all the Jews, Mordechai's people, throughout the kingdom of Achashverosh. So because whatever the rationale, whatever the reason for Mordechai's refusal to bow down, Haman's going to destroy all of the Jewish people. Right? Because it's the family feud thing. So what happens is in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Achashverosh, Pur, which means the lot, it comes from Akkadian, it means a lot, It occurs here a number of times. Elsewhere in the Bible, the word goral is used for a lot. But here, Pur, what's the holiday Purim comes from. Right? It was cast before Haman concerning each day and month till it fell on this 12th month, that is the month of Adar. Haman then said to King Achashverosh, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the other peoples in all the provinces of your realm, whose laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws, and is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. If it please your majesty, let an edict be drawn for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the steward for deposit in the royal treasury. We have this element here, which really we find coming out many times in the history of the Jewish people, that they're accused of somehow being different, having their own traditions, which is true, but saying they don't obey the king's law, which is false. And it's not, it's not to the king's interest to tolerate them. And then the offer of giving money to the king. So Achashverosh, does he understand what's going on? Is he a fool? Is he being manipulated by Haman? Depends on how you want to read the story. Thereupon the king removed his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hamdata, the Agagite, the foe of the Jews. And the king said, the money the people are yours to do with as you see fit. So Achashverosh says, do what you want. And he gives him the signet ring, which was used to sign royal documents. So it says, on the 13th day of the first month, the king's scribes were summoned, and a decree was issued as Haman directed to the king's satraps, to the governors of every province, and to the officials throughout the kingdom, right? Every script. All right, so all this goes out. Accordingly, written instructions were dispatched by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, massacre, and exterminate all the Jews, young and old, children and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. The text of the document was to the effect that a law should be proclaimed in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all the peoples so that they might be ready for that day. So the couriers went out post haste on the royal mission. The decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan. And then it concludes this, the king and Haman sat down to feast. They just sent out a decree to destroy an entire people, and they eat dinner. But the city of Shushan was dumbfounded. Everybody couldn't understand what was going on. So now we've got the crisis. All right. So when Mordecai learned all that had happened, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city crying out loudly and bitterly till he came in front of the palace gate. For one could not enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. No mention of praying. No mention of turning to God. He fetches. Also in every province of the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. But again, nothing about prayer. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was greatly agitated. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear so he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Thereupon Esther summoned Hathach, one of the eunuchs whom the king had appointed to serve her, and sent him to Mordecai to learn the why and wherefore of it all. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the palace, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and all about the money that Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. I'm all shook up over this. Try and work on this. Okay. So now, what's going to happen? So Mordecai lets Esther know what's going on. And he says, show it to Esther, this what the decree, and inform her, and charge her to go to the king and to appeal to him and to plead with him for her people. When Hatach came and delivered Mordecai's message to Esther, Esther told Hatach to take back to Mordecai the following reply. All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's provinces know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, and that he be put to death. Only if the king extends a golden scepter to him may he live. Now I have not been summoned to visit the king for the last 30 days. So Esther says, we know this was the case, that you couldn't come before the king without permission. No, that was to protect him from being assassinated. And if you showed up without being invited, only if he wanted to let you live, did you live. So Esther says, what can I do? He hasn't asked to see me all this time. When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. Don't think you get away just because you're in the palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. It doesn't say God will save us. Again, no mention of God. Another quarter, which is clearly reference to something. But in any case, he says maybe you will perish. And who knows? Perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Why are you queen? Because of this. In order to prevent this, as it says in the Talmud, that before God sends the disease, he sends the cure. Then Esther sent back this answer to Mordecai. Go, assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan, and fast in my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. Then I shall go to the king, though it is contrary to the law. And if I am to perish, I will perish. So Mordecai went about the city and did as Esther commanded him. All right, so now we're setting it up. She says, I'll go see the king. You have everybody fast for 3 days. No prayer. Don't call God on us. Just do that. Okay. Chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther put on royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace, while the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room, facing the entrance of the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter which he had in his hand, and Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. What troubles you, Queen Esther, the king asked her, and what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it should be granted you. It didn't really mean it, but it's a nice way of saying. If it please your majesty, Esther replied, let your majesty and Haman come today to the feast that I prepared for him. King commanded, tell Haman to hurry and do Esther's bidding. So the king and Haman went to the feast that Esther had prepared. Now, this is very strange. Why would Esther want to have Haman come to this feast? Certainly, there is something going on here. And we will see how that all plays out. So at the wine feast, the king asked Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be fulfilled. My wish, replied Esther, my request. If your majesty will do me the favor, if it please your majesty to grant my wish and accede to my request, all these, long request here, let your majesty and Haman come to the feast which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do your majesty's bidding. So again, she summons the king and Haman to come tomorrow. And, Haman's on cloud 9. He gets to eat dinner with the king and the queen and nobody else. So he's obviously feeling very good. That day, Haman went out and happy and lighthearted. When Haman saw Mordecai in the palace gate, and Mordecai did not rise or even stir on his account, Haman was filled with rage at him. Nevertheless, Haman controlled himself and went home. He sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman told them about his great wealth and his many sons, and all about the king had promoted him, advanced him above all the officials and the king's courtiers. What is more, said Haman, Queen Esther gave a feast, and besides the king, she did not have anyone but me. And tomorrow too I'm invited by her along with the king. Yet all of this means nothing to me every time I see that Jew Mordecai sitting in the palace gate. When his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a stake be put up 50 cubits high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. 50 cubits is pretty high up in the air. Even at the smallest measure of it, that's 75 feet. Then you ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then you can go gaily to the king to the feast. The proposal pleased Haman, and he had the stake put up. Okay, so Mordecai and Haman are going to what? Mordecai doesn't know what's going on. Haman's invited to the king's party. Haman says, I'm going, on the advice of his family and friends, going to stick Mordecai up on that spike. Chapter 6, again, we see and note the absence of God. That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals to be brought, and it was read to the king. You know, by chance, he couldn't sleep. By chance, he decided to read the annals. That's not the way a biblical book usually sounds. God took away his sleep. God somehow got the annals there to be read. But no, again, God is missing. Hester Panim, the hidden face of God. Okay, so, and these are the annals. Remember, Mordecai had been written about. There was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guard the threshold, who had plotted to do away with King Ahasuerus. What honor or advancement has been conferred on Mordecai for this? The king inquired. Nothing at all has been done for him, replied the king's servants who were in attendance on him. Okay? Nothing's been done. He hasn't been rewarded. So as at the beginning of the Megillat Esther, the king talks to his advisors, so he's going to talk to an advisor what to do. There he did it with Vashti. That's why some of the rabbis say Memuchan was also another name of Haman. So the king says, who's in the court? The king asked. For Haman had just entered the outer court of the royal palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai impaled on the stake he had prepared for him. Look at the irony here. King just couldn't sleep. He reads in the annals about Mordecai and how he saved him, and he reads how, and he asks what's been done to reward him, and we're told nothing's been done to reward him. And Haman is standing in the court, and Haman wants to have Mordecai impaled on the stake. Okay, so it is Haman standing in the court. The king's servants answered him. Let him enter, said the king. Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let royal garb which the king has worn be brought, and a horse on which the king has ridden, on whose head a royal diadem has been set. And let the attire and the horse be put in the charge of one of the king's noble courtiers. And let the man whom the king desires to honor be attired and paraded on the horse through the city square, while they proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Haman, thinking this is going to be for him, says, what would I want? So he describes what he wants. What does the king say? Quick then, said the king to Haman, get the garb and the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew who sits in the king's gate. Omit nothing of all you have proposed. All right, so now Haman took the garb and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square. And he proclaimed proclaimed before him, this is what is done for the man whom the king desires to honor. All right, so here's Haman wanting to kill Mordecai. He can't even get the king to agree to it. And he's leading Mordecai around town. Certainly, you can understand, well, when Mordecai returned to the king's gate, while Haman hurried home, his head covered in mourning. Now, the rabbis, again, trying to add to the story here, say, what's going on? Well, when he was leading Mordecai around town on the horse, his daughter, Haman's daughter, went up the roof of their house, saw them coming, and assumed that it was Mordecai leading the horse with Haman on top of the horse. So she took the chamber pot, poured it onto the head of whom she thought was Mordecai. Turns out it was her father. Embarrassed and shocked, she throws herself off the roof and dies. That's why Haman is covered in mourning. It doesn't say about anybody else, but that's there. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had befallen him. All right, so what do you want? They should tell him, perk up. Okay, it won't be so bad. You'll find a way around this. It's not all lost. So what do they say though? His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Tough luck. So while they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. They're coming up to the denouement. So the king and Haman came to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Queen Esther replied, if your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondswomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary is not worthy of the king's trouble. We're only sold as slaves, I won't bother you, but they want to kill us. Thereupon King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, who is it? And who is he who would dare to do this? So Esther replies, the adversary and the enemy is this evil Haman. Haman cringed in terror before the king and queen. The king in his fury left the wine feast for the palace garden, while Haman remained to plague with Queen Esther for his life. He pleads with her, oh, save me, I didn't mean anything to you. He didn't know you were Jewish. Where he saw the king and resolved to destroy him. Now, when the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined. He threw himself at her feet, please save me, but either mistaking or really probably not mistaking, knowing what's going on, the king nonetheless says, does he mean, cried the king, to ravish the queen of my own palace? No sooner did these words leave the king's lips than Haman's face was covered. The Harbonah, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, what is more, a stake is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose words saved the king. Impale him on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake which he had put up for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated. Right, so that could have been the end of the story, but it's not really. We have a couple of more chapters yet. So that very day, King Ahasuerus gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai presented himself to the king, for Esther revealed how he's related to her. The king slipped off his ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. Okay, so Mordecai is now the chief honcho in the kingdom. And Esther gave him all of Haman's property. But the story's not over yet. Esther spoke to the king again, falling at his feet and weeping and beseeching him to avert the evil plotted by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the royal scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. If it please your majesty, said, and if I won your favor and the proposal seems right to your majesty, and if I am pleasing to you, let dispatches be written countermanding those that which were written by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, embodying his plot to annihilate the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people? And how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then Achashverosh said to Queen Esther and Mordechai the Jew, I have given Haman's property to Esther, and he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews. And you may further write with regard to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet, for an edict has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked. Right? We don't know of any such ruling in Persia, but he says once the law is given, you can't revoke the law, but you can write something to kind of offset it. So the king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the third month, that is the month of Sivan, so we were way ahead of the story. Letters are written in Mordechai's dictation to the Jews and the satraps, the governors and officials of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own language, script and language. He had them written in the name of King Achashverosh and sealed with the king's signet. Letters were dispatched by mounted couriers riding steeds used in the king's service, bred of the royal stud. To this effect, the king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed force together with women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day in all the provinces of King Achashverosh, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. The text of the document was to be issued as a law in every province. It was to be proudly displayed, publicly displayed to all the people, so that the Jews would be ready for that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers mounted on royal steeds went on urgent haste to the king's command. The decree was proclaimed in the fortress of Shushan. So he sends out, the Jews can defend themselves. And they can take everything, they can destroy you, your wives, your children, take all of your property, etc. The king left Mordechai left the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white with a magnificent crown of gold and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool. And the city of Shushan rang with joyous cries. The Jews enjoyed light, gladness, happiness, and honor. In every province, every city where the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and enjoyment of the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Many of the people of the land professed to be Jews for fear the Jews had fallen upon them. So finally, on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, the king's command and decree were to be executed. The very day in which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened, and the Jews got their enemies in their power. Throughout the provinces of King Achashverosh, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt, and no one could withstand them for the fear that had fallen upon all the peoples. Indeed, all the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and the king's stewards showed deference to the Jews because the fear of Mordechai had fallen upon them. For Mordechai was now powerful in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading throughout the provinces. The man Mordechai was growing ever more powerful. So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slaying and destroying. They wreaked their will upon their enemies. In the fortress Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men. They also killed, and then traditionally these are the 10 sons of Haman, and the person reading Megillah Esther is supposed to read them out in one breath. And I used to do this on occasion. Ushashin habira, hargu hayudim v'yabei chamesh me'od ish. Viet Prashadana Viet Elefan Viet Sapad Viet Varata Viet Alaya Viet Oradaita Pamashta Viet Orisai Ridai Varizaita Aser Benehama Nata Sayudim Haragu Vabiza Lo Shochu Yadam. So it's all 10 sons, but it's significant. And again, I think this is not accidental. It says they didn't lay their hands on the spoil. Why did King Saul lose the kingdom? Because his armies, the people with him, had taken their cattle and claimed they were going to offer him a sacrifice to God, but they weren't supposed to. It was supposed to be total destruction with all the issues that there's there, we won't go into. But here it emphasizes that they did not do that. So when the number of those slain in the fortress of Shushan was reported on the same day to the king said to Queen Esther, in the fortress Shushan alone, the Jews have killed a total of 500 men, as well as the 10 sons of Haman. What then must they have done in the provinces of the realm? What is your wish now? It should be granted you, and what else is your request should be fulfilled. If it please your majesty, Esther replied, let the Jews in Shushan be permitted to act tomorrow also as they did today, and let Haman's sons be impaled on the stake. The king ordered this should be done, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan. So his sons are impaled. They get to fight another day. That's why Shushan celebrates Purim the day after the victory. The rest of the kingdom, the day after the victory, was the 14th of Adar. And in Shushan, it was the 15th of Adar. And they were told about there was merrymaking and all of this, how this is recorded and sent out by the command of Esther and Mordecai to all the Jews throughout the kingdom to celebrate this every year, sending gifts of food to their friends, etc. And Ahasuerus was a great king and all of that, and end of the story. So when we go through Megillat Esther, we see that there are certain problematic aspects to it. One of the terms that use is it was a farce. A farce is a specific term for kind of fiction, not that it was not supposed to be understood as not having some degree of element of truth to it, but not to be taken directly seriously. Okay, so we will in Toronto read Megillat Esther on the 14th of Adar. If you manage to make it to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, or to various, I think Sfat also, they will read it on the 15th of Adar. If you go to Tel Aviv and then go to Jerusalem the next day, you can read it both times. You can have lots of meals. But it is a joyous, festive time. After the winter in Israel, the winter is starting to dissipate here. Obviously, it's a long ways off dissipating, but that's important. Okay, do we have any kinds of questions tonight? You have to unmute yourself, wave your hand or something. No, nothing. Well, in that case, I will say goodnight to everyone, and I'll see you, God willing, next week. Okay?
Night, Rabbi. Thank you.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Bye.